Good evening and welcome to the Alchemical Tours podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Hinde.
So you've just come back from breaking conventions. So just tell me, what is breaking conventions?
So Breaking Conventions is one of the largest conferences for the study of psychedelic consciousness. It's certainly the biggest conference in Europe, and it takes place at the University of Greenwich in London every 2 years. I think it's been going since about 2011, but it's just got bigger and bigger and bigger each time.
Okay, and so what exactly happens there? Do just people talk about psychedelics, or is there presumably people aren't selling psychedelics? I don't know. So what exactly are people's motives for going?
It seems to be a real mix of different types of people who attend breaking conventions. I think that's one of the really nice things about the conference is that there's such a diverse group of people with every possible interest in psychedelics who come together, and there seems to be a nice and very open and friendly culture between all those different types of people, which kind of gives it a certain there's a certain sort of pioneering and fun atmosphere to the whole thing. Almost like a party atmosphere to the whole thing. And in fact, there are DJs and parties going on late into the night for those with the stamina.
That's sick. Oh, awesome. So what were your motives for going to breaking conventions?
Well, I've been interested in psychedelics for various reasons for quite a few years. And I became aware of breaking conventions probably, I don't know, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago. I'd heard a lot about psychedelics and research and so on various podcasts like the Joe Rogan podcast. And it seemed to me that a lot of the people who were being interviewed on these podcasts that had very interesting and open points of view were actually at this conference speaking. So I wanted to sort of go along and sort of hear what they had to say firsthand, and perhaps talk to them and talk to other people and kind of bring my knowledge up to another level.
Okay, so was there anyone in particular that you sort of met and learnt something from this time around?
Well, it's a bit of a strange process. I mean, one thing that has to be said is that the schedule is intense. There are probably 4 or 5 simultaneous tracks running over 3 days, plus there are films showing, plus there's a whole kind of set of workshops running. There's people selling books, people selling products. There are art installations. There are areas so all this is happening simultaneously. It's a bit like a sort of festival type scenario with the intensity of it. So once you kind of get there, it's a bit of a sort of psychedelic experience. Just being there, there's just so many interesting things you could be doing simultaneously. So I did spend quite a bit of time beforehand sitting down with a program, coming up with a plan, hoping to interview specific people for my podcast and hoping to go and talk to certain people. But I must admit, when I arrived, most of those plans just dissolved away, and I got swept up in slightly, knee-jerk or spontaneous reactions to go and listen to certain things. And I kind of, by the end of the first day, I completely changed my motives for being there and what I was going to go and see. That's the truth of it.
So was there anything in particular that you sort of went and saw and found particularly interesting?
There are just a lot of things I saw and found interesting. I sat down today because having come back, I had a lot of notes and cards and photographs, and just sort of things in my head that I was a little bit worried I would, would just sort of dissolve away over the next week or two. So I actually spent quite a bit of time today sort of journaling and sitting down and trying to remember what was important from the whole thing. Because I remember when I went 2 years ago, I made all sorts of contacts and, all, picked up on all sorts of references and so on. And it's taken me most of the 2 years to follow up on all those things. So I was just very aware of that, and that going along is like a sort of download of all sorts of interesting information and references. And the main thing I wanted to do is just make sure I could get back to each of those things and take some time. But to answer your question specifically, I could give some for instances maybe. So, I mean, one thing I did on one thing that interests me greatly is the use of psychedelics by indigenous people in their traditional setting, because I've always felt that taking a psychedelic is a lot more than just taking a chemical and having a trip.
Yeah.
So what interests me is how they were used traditionally, and what is the experience if they're taken authentically.
So do tribes literally travel to breaking conventions?
I mean, that's the crazy thing about the whole thing. The whole conference is slightly unbelievable in the way it runs, because yes, there are. I spent quite a bit of time on. Was it Sunday? It might have been Sunday. There was a session for most of the day with talks from indigenous tribes, and there were members of the Wiratari tradition, who are shaman who live in an isolated part of northwest Mexico, who were there talking about their ceremony with peyote and the challenges with the modern world encroaching on their territory. The conference had flown them in.
Wow.
And I think the reason why that can happen is that quite a few of the people organising the conference have been out to these places to experience and live with these people. So there's a very good level of trust amongst a lot of the people centrally involved with the conference and some of these tribes. Later that day there was an iboga shaman from the Gabon in Africa.
Oh, right.
Now, in the Gabon, they have a tradition which is called the Bwiti, Bwiti, and it's sort of deep. It's a deep African tradition which is sort of in the sort of depths of the jungle in Gabon, but is now, pretty famous, I guess, around the world, where they take a substance known as iboga, which is a particular plant. The active psychedelic ingredient is ibogaine, and you can either take iboga in the plant form, or you can take a sort of synthetic version of it. They're meant to give slightly different experiences. But this is a very powerful psychedelic, perhaps one of the most powerful psychedelics. And it was something I became aware of many years ago. I think the first Bruce Parry documentary, when he went for his first experience, was with iboga, with this particular tradition. And yeah, so there was kind of one of the shamans of that tradition at breaking conventions, talking about, in quite a lot of depth what it involves and so on. And the nice thing is that the Gabon is a sort of former French territory, and so he speaks fluent French, and he was being translated into English, but I speak French, so I did have a long conversation with him afterwards, and we had a very interesting conversation because nobody else seemed to speak French, so we just sat down and talked. And that's the sort of thing you can do in breaking conventions, is you can just find yourself with these people who you would never normally meet, having an amazing conversation. So that's, just one example of an amazing conversation I had, going to his talks, and also just sort of sitting down with him and just asking the questions you would have, So I've got quite a lot of notes about that, plus, contacts with him and his family now. So, yeah. I mean, there's just... I've actually written down in my notebook 36
my days.
different things that during those 3 days that were of interest. So
almost 36 different podcasts, I'm saying.
Of which iboga is number one, perhaps in the list for various reasons. Maybe the first day I got there, I think was I got there Thursday because it started on Friday morning.
Okay.
And this time I stayed at the university, which means that you're staying where all the speakers are staying, and you're central to the whole thing, which is, whereas last time I was sort of commuting in and out from staying away from Greenwich. I sort of arrived there, and I just thought I'd go down and register early, and then I bumped into a lady who worked for the UN in Geneva, who was coming over.
No way.
And she was interested in, the whole kind of deregulation of psychedelics and so on. So a lot of people are kind of dipping in to, this is a great place to go and orientate yourself. There's researchers there who are, doing pioneering research at universities like UCL and Imperial and Johns Hopkins University in the US and so on. They're at the cutting edge of the research. There are the sort of indigenous shamans and people studying them. There's psychologists, there are therapists, there are counselors, there are people selling various products. There are people running retreats in Amsterdam. There are people, there is just hundreds and hundreds of people with every possible interest into the psychedelic world. As I said, there seems to be a certain sort of excitement that this is a sort of pioneering time, a reawakening.
Certainly feels like it.
So yeah, on the Thursday evening when I met this lady, apparently she'd got a ticket to go and see psychedelic comedy, and I hadn't realised that was on, so I just went with her, and we ended up at the theatre. And I managed to get, blag my way in to psychedelic comedy. And there was an absolutely amazing comedy set, which by an American comedian called Sean Mouse.
Okay.
And, he would be of the sort of standard you'd expect at the Comedy Store or something like that.
Oh, amazing.
And I think I was quite tired because I travelled, and I was sitting there, I was thinking, I was thinking, just really keeping this lady company. And I was thinking, I might not enjoy this at all, but pretty quickly I realised this guy was amazing. He not only was a very good comedian, he also understood the whole psychedelic world inside out, and he'd obviously had personal experience with everything.
What was his name again?
Shane Mouse.
Shane Mouse, okay.
Yeah, so he also, I think, runs some sort of retreats in the Caribbean for people doing psychedelics. I can remember his first joke was, there are no bad jokes, there are just difficult jokes for you to navigate.
Said by a true psychedelic.
But I think one of the nice things about his psychedelic comedy is that it made gentle fun of the whole kind of psychedelic movement in a very good way. You know, he said, you know, and his sort of next set of jokes were, we don't need Western medicine anymore. We've got psychedelics. Polio, we can cure that with DMT. Plague, just a quick dose of mushrooms. We've got nothing in our civilization worth keeping. All we need to do is take a heroic dose of mushrooms. Anyway, he was just very on it, and I think it was just a really good start to the conference to have somebody like that just sort of getting everyone into more of a playful mood. So he was amazing. I could go on. I mean, there was another thing that was amazing is there was a film that had been made with many of the sort of central figures in the sort of that attend breaking conventions, and it was made by. It was called A Journey to the Edge of Consciousness by Rob Harper. This was like a pre-release. He just finished it. And it was a totally amazing film that we, just a small group of people got to pre-watch and then talk to the director. And it kind of is a film that he made after having a very strong experience himself in order to kind of reintegrate. It's an animated film, and it starts off looking at Timothy Leary, and, and the first time
very controversial
he took LSD, and and really interesting, and it also takes quite an unusual viewpoint. It shows him as a father with two young children who suddenly bumps into this English eccentric who had LSD. And sort of being very sort of scientific, and because he was in Harvard, and very sort of sort of standoffish, sort of trying to find out what the experience was about. And various people in his who were dropping in as guests in his house weren't so sort of reserved about it, and just sort of took some LSD and had amazing experiences in his house. So this was all sort of unraveling in an out of control way until finally he took a very large dose. And the rest is history somehow. So there are about 6 or 7 moments in the history of the psychedelic movement which the film portrays, and they're interleaved with interviews from sort of kind of experts. Graham Hancock's interviewed, and and Dave Luke, who is who runs breaking conventions and is at University of Greenwich, is interviewed. Some really great interviews there, and the whole film was amazing. We were all just completely glued to it, and then we got a chance to talk to him about how he'd come to make this film and so on. So that was really interesting, and that will be released in I think in the next few weeks and be available.
What was it called again?
It is called Journey to the Edge of Consciousness. Rob Harper. I've actually written to him and asked if he would like to do a podcast interview on it as well.
Awesome, yeah.
So that's the beauty of being there.
Of course, yeah.
So we will see. I mean, another amazing thing that I went to is there was a whole half day on psychedelic Africa, and there's the iboga thing, but I really must admit I don't know a lot about African culture. I know a lot about Indian culture and Asian culture, but I've got a bit of a blind spot when it comes to African culture. So one of the things I found myself doing is, rather than going to the things where I knew stuff about and getting more knowledge, there were many sort of scientific talks and things on DMT and Asian traditions and South American traditions. I found myself gravitating towards stuff I didn't know anything about, just to throw myself into kind of out of my comfort zone. And this African track was totally amazing. it started off with a lady talking about yoga and the fact that yoga comes from Africa and psychedelic yoga. I mean, this is just... her name is Sine Orchi, and so she's teaching yoga in London and running these workshops in various places in the world. And they're doing yoga and they're taking psychedelics at the same time. And she's sort of talking about the body actually then becoming very sort of intuitive, and rather than the sort of blocks of people trying to move their bodies into certain positions and things, rather reluctantly, that the body itself becomes very spontaneous. And so she was showing a lot of history from ancient Egypt, from the sort of hieroglyphics and so that was showing yoga postures, and how from Ethiopia and Egypt culture had spread to India via the Dravidians, and that yoga, the roots of yoga, or some of the roots of yoga, into India and to us might have been via Africa, which is something I never really understood. I thought it was all sort of the Aryans and the Indian culture. So yeah, I got some references for that. So I find myself being constantly re-educated, and I realise I don't really know anything.
I knew nothing to begin with. Now I'm suddenly learning it all.
Yeah, so that was amazing. I don't know. There are just so many different things. I mean, one interesting thing was that Gail Bradbrook was there from Extinction Rebellion.
Oh, cool.
And she gave... she's a very powerful speaker.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard her speak.
Yeah.
So she talked about how she got the inspiration and force to start Extinction Rebellion from taking psychedelics. That was her
That's
talk.
incredible.
And I think there are various versions of that in the press. And she told one of the stories where she'd gone and taken iboga, I think, in Costa Rica. And, that had just kind of really kind of turned her inside out, and she'd gone there with a particular intention of finding the way of helping the environment and getting the force to do that. It was an amazing talk. I would really recommend listening to that. I'm sure that will be up. Like all the talks, they will all be available for free on the Breaking Conventions website. So that would be certainly one to listen to. One thing she said, which was, I guess, controversial, but the way she thinks, is that she said she would be perfectly happy to support and sanction a civil disobedience where people took psychedelics in a mass way around the country.
No way, that was so cool.
That with that group of people. So she's, the things she said were very powerful about the fact that it's kind of too late in terms of the environmental crisis to take slow steps, and I hadn't heard her speak before, and whereas I've got a lot of friends who went to the Extinction Rebellion in London, and I could see really how the whole movement had come about by hearing her. Maybe you know more than me. Maybe you were already in touch with her. I think it's not my generation who's very good at being more engaged, I guess.
Yeah, to a degree, I guess, about the environment and things, mainly because studying biology. One question that comes to mind is, everyone there seems very open to talk about psychedelics and their own personal experiences, and sort of even like small businesses based around psychedelics. Is that something that sort of just is accepted, that everyone's open, even though, it's still illegal in this country?
It is kind of strange. I mean, I think when I went the first time, I really didn't quite know what the protocol was, because you don't usually in normal society go up to somebody and ask them what psychedelics they've tried. There's obviously a taboo, and also there are legal issues that these class 1 and class 2 substances are criminalized. I think the thing to say is that people aren't taking psychedelics at the conference. The conference is a conference and inquiry talking about psychedelics. The people who are offering psychedelic therapies and so on are doing that by taking people to Amsterdam or Spain or to other places, or they're in areas of the world, such as parts of the US and Canada, where psychedelics are legal. There's also a strong core of academics, I guess, within the conference, which I guess adds some rigor, and they're coming from a place where they're kind of aware of how to have conversations and to study, in a way that wouldn't be criminal or illegal. So they're doing that in territories or in universities that've got licenses to do such studies. So that adds a certain tone, I guess, to the whole conference. But in general, I think most of the people there have had personal experience with psychedelics in some context, and there is a kind of very strong supportive culture. It is the case that you could sit and talk to just about anyone there about psychedelics. There are many people with experiences of counselling, of therapy, of work with psychedelics, running retreats with psychedelics, or with research and protocols with psychedelics. So it is a very unique gathering from that point of view. If you wanted to sit and talk to people about psychedelics, you could just go there and sit in the cafe and you wouldn't be bored, I think, for the whole day.
I could never be bored talking about psychedelics.
I don't know if that answered your question. But
no, yeah.
It was just. One of the not all the talks were about psychedelics as well. There were some talks that were looking at other ways at getting at alternate states. Dave Luke talked about non-psychedelic trips.
Oh, right.
So one of the things he talked about was a set of experiments he'd been involved with at the University of London, which involved creating a dark chamber. I'm struggling for the word now. What's the word for a chamber where you don't get any sound?
Sensory deprivation.
Yeah, that sort of thing. It's got a fancy Latin
fancy word,
which has just escaped me. So apparently by putting people into this chamber, they often report psychedelic-like experiences, and it's a chamber that kind of sucks. It's like a dementor. It sucks all the sound out of the room, so that even if you make a sound, it's dissipated and taken away.
No, that's fascinating.
That's insane. So there are some people who go in there and can't, press the panic button and come out straight away. But there are people who've kind of reported psychedelic experience. So there's a number of ways that you could have, psychedelic experiences aren't necessarily linked to taking chemicals. It could be drumming. It could be shamanic. It could, through, there are various rituals, or there are, going in the dark for a while. So there are various traditions around the world where people go into a dark cave and spend, in some examples, the shamans in the Amazon, I believe, go into the dark for up to 9 months in order to prepare for their
that's mad.
Their careers as shamans. Yeah. So they get, I guess they are not in touch with this world, they get in touch with another world. So that was interesting. I met a Welsh storyteller, Eric Madden, who is kind of part of the Druid and Celtic traditions, and he goes to places in Wales and tells stories and runs story retreats, and he also runs a lot of events where he gets in touch with different shamanic traditions around the world and runs sort of conferences with them. I actually went to an event where he was telling stories in the evening.
Okay.
And so that was enjoyable. And it's just literally you sort of have breakfast and you go from one amazing experience to the next.
Sounds amazing. Got to go next time.
You must come. I could just go on and on.
Were there any... So something that I'm really interested in, and that's actually been in the news quite a lot recently, and a lot of research as well, is the use of psychedelics for treatment of addiction or alcoholism or mental health sort of areas. So use of psychedelics as almost therapy. Was there much talk about that?
There was a lot of talk about that. So that, there were a lot of tracks, some of which I didn't go to, that were talking about therapies from lots of points of view. So obviously, not obviously, there is an organisation called MAPS in the US, which has been going for a long time and has been doing research into psychedelics and bringing together researchers. So they've got a full-time staff, and they've developed a therapy which is suitable for PTSD and possibly depression, involving MDMA, which is going through its clinical trials at the moment. I think it's going through phase 2.
Oh, wow.
And it's being sort of fast-tracked, and eventually there's a training for therapists, plus a license to allow them to use MDMA with therapy, and that will eventually come to Europe, and they are starting to train up therapists here. So there are therapists already involved in the trial. So I think that's very exciting. And
very promising.
That's getting really good results. There was a really interesting talk by Robin Carhart Harris. I don't know if you've heard of him. He is a researcher at, I think he was originally at University of Bristol. He's at Imperial, and he's doing some research into psilocybin and DMT, and he uses MRI scans of the brain and so on. So he was talking about the difference between using SSRIs and using psychedelics in terms of what happens to the brain receptors. That I think you would find very interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
So basically what he said is that if you take a SSRI, now I might get this wrong, but this is my own recollection of what he said. There is a paper, we could add the reference to the paper for people who are interested, and to the talk. But basically it's a typical SSRI is acting on serotonin receptors. So I think the SSRIs act on the 5-HT1 AR receptor, right? So and the result of that is that people become, people who have a depression or a mental health issue find that they're able to cope better by taking the SSRIs. That's the theory, if they're given at the right dose and the right SSRI. So what he classes that as is passive coping.
Okay.
So passive coping is that you can mitigate the stress, you can get by, but maybe you're not as functional as you used to be. It's almost like you've suppressed the your kind of activity in the brain. Now, what he's what his studies show is that if you gave somebody psilocybin, then it affects the 5-HT2AR receptors. And what that does is it removes some of the upregulation, because the model is that there's a sort of lower part of the brain and upper part of the brain, and the problem is in the relationship between those two.
Okay.
And it's almost like getting back to the more kind of intuitive part of the brain, the lower part of the brain, and reactivating that without it being suppressed by the wrong sort of activity in the higher part of the brain. I'm sort of paraphrasing this and probably destroying it in a bad way. But what he characterised that as active coping and transformation, and kind of changing your patterns where you could adapt to whatever your life was throwing at you in a very active and engaged way, and not just be kind of dulled down. So that's kind of what his lab are pioneering, and so he's got a number of papers around differentiating between SSRI type therapy versus psychedelic therapy. I found all that quite interesting.
Oh yeah, very interesting. Yeah, particularly, I completely agree that I've recently read a book called Lost Connections by Jonathan Harari, I think. I may have butchered that. It talks about how the extent of SSRIs are actually incredibly limited, and there is a small section on psychedelics. So I think psychedelics could well be quite a significant impact on treating people with sort of mental health issues or alcoholism and such.
Yeah, I mean, one very interesting talk I went to at the end was in this sort of indigenous stream, and they'd again, it's totally incredible. They'd flown this native Canadian healer or shaman, and it seemed she lived 300 miles north of any civilization in Canada.
Okay, wow.
Because some of the native peoples are really in the far north. And she'd been down to Peru to kind of relearn from a healer in Peru some of the uses of psychedelic medicines.
Okay.
And then she'd taken that back to Canada and also adapted it through and found psychedelic plants they had there and rediscovered them. And one of the things she was describing is that one of the big problems for native people in Canada is historically there's been a lot of abuse in the sort of state school system for native peoples.
Oh, wow.
And they've got a history of 100 years of being sort of second-class citizens and abuse. So she was finding that these psychedelic medicines were able to allow these people to find some healing and to kind of move beyond that sort of that state of kind of being abused and as a people and individually. I found that fascinating. I mean, there were just so many stories like that of using psychedelic medicines to get past a trauma. I think as soon as you hear this stuff, you think, well, this is, it just is complete nonsense that it should be illegal to research this stuff.
It's fascinating, literally fascinating. I'm reading How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan at the moment, and it talks a lot about this stuff. And I find it incredibly fascinating that it's also so ingrained in culture. You have these tribes that the whole religions are based around it, or rituals based around it. I find that really, really fascinating as well.
I mean, I could go on and on, but I think maybe what we should do is do some individual podcasts on some of these things in more depth.
100%. Yeah, I'd be really up for that.
We'll get some more information.
You've been listening to the Alchemical Tours podcast with Dr. Stephen Hinde. You can subscribe via iTunes, YouTube, Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Mixcloud, and other well-known platforms. Please do not forget to recommend and rate us. If you have any comments, ideas, or corrections, please do not hesitate to email us at podcast@alchemicaltours.com or contact us via Facebook or Twitter. We always love to hear from you. This podcast is community funded and not for profit. To support us, please subscribe to our Patreon page at patreon.com/alchemicaltours. Until next time, this is the Alchemical Tours podcast, and thank you for listening.